Previously on the Seventh Valkyrie, BC's life gets even more complicated as Cyrus arrives in the Old City. Now, as the Machine King's shadow is looming over all of Rene and tensions are rising between Old and New City, BC is caught up in all of it. As the weight on her shoulders grows, what's next for her? Well, find out next on the Seventh Valkyrie. Chapter 14. Frayed. BC. The 10th day of winter. Midday. BC fished into her coat jacket for her last ferret of the day as she skirted the docks towards the riverside lowlands, clicking her teeth with frustration as she did. She smoked a whole hell of a lot more when she was preoccupied, and it pissed her off to see such a simple sign that she was clearly on edge. Well, that and the fact that running out of ferrets always sucked. Checking her mental list of the girls she had left to visit, she ran through another mental list of each of their vices. Vora loved men, Cinda had a penchant for blitz powder, Lil was a huge fan of green, Piona loved women and was trying to kick a penchant for moondust, Bea loved liquor, and... she was pretty sure that Sylphie smoked like a pissed-off Firelander. You never knew when it might be handy to know who had access to what. Shifting her course slightly, BC adjusted her route to loop uphill through the riverside lowlands, away from the coast. That would take her past Sylphie first, and she could re-up her ash leaf before the rest of the circuit and still be back to Velvet before it got too late. There were curfews enforced throughout the city now. Well, somewhat. They weren't official in the way that Eterins liked to make things official with decrees and signage, but the families had equally effective methods of being obeyed, and their punishments were far more severe. It was also very strongly suggested that everyday citizens make their way directly to their place of work and then immediately return home. This was the first time since the Eterin War that such rules had been in place, and to BC it was the first major sign of the family's war on the Machine King, adding even more security to a town that was already a fortress. One of the many contradictions of the Old City was that despite all of the decadence and hidden desires, the layers and layers of subterfuge as well, there was no one outside of the families who expected to be able to do anything secretly. Even in the good times when everything was going smoothly, it was safer to assume that when two people met, there were at least 3 sets of eyes and ears listening and paying attention. And now, with the people of the Old City confined to even more rigid routines, those eyes and ears would be even more sharply focused on anything out of the ordinary. The second shot in the family's war on the Machine King was far more conspicuous, BC thought, as she cast her eyes to the ground and stepped out of the way of 2 salt-hardened soldiers of the Seekers of Dawn on patrol. Even as part of senior pit staff, it was better to avoid any unwanted attention, and pissing off a stray family soldier was just fucking stupid. Ground soldiers of any family, even the minor ones, rarely strutted around so clearly and openly ready for battle. Sure, a trained eye could spot family muscle from down the street, even in plain clothes, but in peacetime, the Old City was meant to be a haven, and that meant no clearly armed fighters wandering the street looking for shit. Sending them out so plainly was a conspicuous show of force, and as the Seekers passed her, BC also saw a few sets of eyes watching the soldiers from porches and sheltered doorways. When the Seekers faded from view, their gazes zipped right back to BC, though. Everyone, not just BC, was on edge. Anything out of the ordinary would be spotted, documented, and reported fast. Even more so than in usual times. And that surveillance was one of the reasons that the Machine King had never really tried to touch this place outside of a few visits they'd done in deep, deep cover. And in fact, even sometimes that didn't work. It was a similar failed foray, that had led to BC's separation from the Machine King, and to her knowledge, that was the last Krona had ever been here. BC spat on the ground in frustration. Of course he hadn't stopped working at taking over Rene. He'd just been playing another angle, this time involving the Eterans. Exactly how he had maneuvered Etera wasn't clear, but with Krona there were never coincidences, and he'd always had contacts high up in Etera. While he was here, things between the two sides would get worse, not better. Absent-mindedly, BC reached for another ferret, found nothing, and then quickened her pace towards Sylphie's place, one of the little one-roomers that dotted this side of the slope. Sylphie's was cleaner than most on the winding dirt road, but she wasn't out on the front porch like many of her neighbors. Instead, as BC strode onto the porch, she noticed that the doors were locked shut, and the scent of heavy ash leaf smoke hung in the air. After knocking and calling out, BC was happy to see Sylphie's curls, brown eyes, and milk chocolate skin as she peeked from around the door. With a sigh, Sylphie closed the door again, clicking open a chain lock that wouldn't do much to a determined intruder, and then she opened the door with welcome arms, surrounded by a plume of smoke. "I've rarely seen a hotbox with ash leaf," BC said. "Gives you a hell of a headache, doesn't it? What's the occasion?" Peering into the room, BC caught a glimpse of the glowing embers of a hookah against the bed, crammed in the corner. Next to the hookah, huddled on the floor with a blanket wrapped around them, was some guest of Sylphie's. "Who's that?" BC asked under her breath, nodding towards the figure. "You know we're supposed to keep visitors to a It's just Fiona," Sylphie said quickly, drawing a wave and a weak hello from the blanketed girl, whose shining white hair fell across her face as she turned to see BC. Fiona was a delicate, wiry Icelander, and she'd looked about half melted, her eyes sunken in and skin pale as death, which was saying something for an Icelander. "Fucking hell, Fiona, what happened to you?" BC asked. "You look like you just got through a week's worth of pit parties in one night." Fiona smiled weakly. "I picked a bad week to try to quit Moondust again," Fiona said in her thick northern accent. "Oh, fuck, P," BC said. "Well, I guess nearly killing yourself with Ashleaf will do something for that. Why haven't you gone to the Wild Women? You could have asked. We could have made an introduction and gotten you out there." "They're full," Fiona said. "We tried, no space." Sylphie piped in. "Families are too occupied with their lockdowns to keep the suppliers supplied, and any independent dealer has gone underground or gotten real hard to find. Moondust supply practically dried up overnight," Sylphie explained. "And that means we've got a whole town's worth of junkies who were all just forced to quit cold turkey," BC said. "Fuck. Sorry, P, I didn't mean to call you a junkie. Even I know the allure of an old comet ride when things get a little too stressful, so I'm certainly not one to judge." Fiona took a hit on the hookah like she'd been drowning, and the smoke was her only air. And then she breathed it all out, coughing and offering another weak smile. "This helps. I mean, I'd been trying to get clean for a while, so I'm not as bad as I could be," Fiona said. I know some people who are seriously considering dagger dust as an alternative." The mention of dagger dust made BC curse again. One of the harsh truths of the old city was that not everyone who dipped a toe into the whirlpool of song and substance here made it out. Some people, and BC knew of more than she liked to admit, simply fell deeper and deeper into the cycle of addiction. The families tended to keep them alive with a small supply of mediocre moon dust at cut rates, in exchange for extended, cheap labor contracts performing dangerous or odd jobs around the town. The Wild Women held open their doors to anyone seeking guidance or healing, and their methods for curing withdrawals and addiction were supposedly brutal but effective. Well, depending on who you asked. There were rumors that about half of people found healthier places to live and left, and the other half were carried deep into the woods and laid to rest. But with the Wild Woman beyond capacity and the families otherwise occupied, there was a much, much worse alternative for people who were desperate for a fix. Dagger dust, a poorly distilled, flesh-rotting and mind-rotting byproduct of moon dust. It left users with telltale scars all across their body, lifelong mental side effects, and, well, a one-way trip to decomposing in the gutter. If dagger dust was on the streets, then things were getting dangerous in the old city. BC reached up for another ferret, swearing again when she came up empty.
Oi, everything okay, BC?
Sylphie asked nervously.
Yeah, all good, but god damn it, do you have some ash leaf? I assume you do based on the smoke in the air, but fuck could I use another ferret. Oh, yeah, we got heaps,
Sylvie said.
At least that grows nearby. We got bushels of it.
Where? BC asked. Sylphie gestured to the back table. BC tossed Sylphie a gold piece and headed over, skillfully plucking out some ground ash leaf, rolling a ferret, and then lighting it with one of her fire sticks and dragging deep.
You know, you could have just hit the hookah, right?
Fiona asked. BC waved her off, dragging deep on the ferret and then sighing out twin plumes of smoke from her nose. Breathing deep, BC hit the ferret again and blew out some smoke rings, and then glanced to the expectant girls before throwing up a middle finger.
Well, because fuck you, that's why,
BC said, holding a fierce expression for just long enough that the girls all busted out laughing. A moment like this, it was almost like nothing had changed.
You girls mind if I cop the rest of this little small bag? BC asked.
You can keep the change from that gold.
Well, shit, for a gold you can take as much as you like,
Sylvie said.
You watch out, I might just take you up on that,
BC said as she chewed on the ferret and finished topping off her ash leaf pouch. She could roll on the road as she needed.
As for you, Fiona, staying out here fiending in a dark room is not going to keep you safe. You are going to come up with me to Velvet and we'll find you a place to stay. Seriously, B, I'll be fine,
Fiona said.
And besides, Sylphie's here keeping an eye on me.
I'll let you have all of my moon dust I've got left, BC said. Fiona whipped her head around so quickly she nearly knocked over the hookah, then started coughing to cover up that instinctual, desperate reaction. Sylphie, realizing how bad things had gotten, looked at the ground, and BC sighed, walking over and kneeling next to Fiona.
I'm sorry, babe. I didn't mean to trick you. I didn't mean to make you feel like an idiot, and
you can actually have all of my moon dust if you want it, BC said in a quiet whisper, pulling Fiona over and giving her a hug.
But right now things are hard in this city, and trying to kick a habit like that is even harder. You need to be with family, where you have people you can count on and trust, not sitting here in some mediocre, Sylphie, shack, fucking wasting away. Fiona let her head fall to BC's chest, and with quiet words, BC soothed the shivering Icelander. Feeling BC's arms around her, Fiona let out a crying,
gasping sob and finally slumped into a pile against BC. I'm tired, Fiona said. I haven't felt clean in years. BC stroked the girl's hair. I know, baby. We'll get you out of this shack. We'll get you to Velvet. You can get a nice long bath and start to relax. And we'll see what we can do. I don't want to go to Velvet. I want to go home. I want to go back to Reichsburg, and I want to lay in the snow. I want to eat stew and Gelsfeld. I don't want to be in the city anymore. BC patted Fiona's back, holding her, and then nodded to Sylphie, who was leaning back against the wall with her arms crossed. She looked like she was trying to be strong, but BC could tell she was at her wit's end as well. Sylphie, can you stay here for a little while? BC asked. I don't need more than an hour, maybe a little more. Just gotta check on everyone this side of town. Then I'll come back and take you both up to Velvet. Get packed, pack light, and be ready to move. It's gonna be after dark, and I don't want any fucking trouble. Sylphie nodded, getting a little bit more confidence after BC's instructions, and she came over, kneeling down and holding Fiona while BC stepped back and stood, giving them both a goodbye and then heading towards the door. As the door went shut behind her, BC heard Fiona cry out in a renewed batch of sobs, and underneath it and somewhere in around it she could hear Sylphie trying to comfort the other girl. BC leaned against one of the porch's supports, rolling another ferret, breathing it in and then slumping against the wooden beam. It buckled slightly under her weight, but settled in, and for a moment BC looked out across the sky. It was getting on towards late afternoon, and she had 8 more visits to make before sundown, and then the long journey back to Velvet. Want to know what happens next? Join us on Patreon to become a hero of Edera and get early access to episodes along with bonus features, director's commentary, and the full Tab to archive. You can also find other ways to support us at the links in the description, and we will see you next week.